Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jim Ogle, Executive Director of Freedom's Frontier National Heritage Area. Welcome to tonight's continuing program on the National Park Service's Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. Today, we take you to a site in a museum that protects the heritage and the stories of people displaced by the building of a dam. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items for you as attendees. As you watch the presentation, you may find that a question comes to mind. There are two ways to ask questions. The first is to click on the question and answer button, usually at the bottom of the screen, and type in your question. I'll be happy to add your questions to our discussions. You can also ask your question on your own. To do so, click to raise your hand. I'll call on you to open both your audio and video if you turn on your camera. So as the mood strikes you, please ask your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our program. Marin Massa is the current president of the Clinton Lake Historical Society, having served in multiple roles for 17 years. Her board of directors she describes as a hands-on group, and they wear many hats. Some of hers, she's told me, are creating exhibits, hosting kids camps, and helping with research. Her husband, son, all live in Clinton, moving to Clinton 20 years ago. She was lucky enough to make friends with several older neighbors who shared their stories of the good old days before the lake. This sparked her interest in local history, which led her to Martha Parker and the museum. For her paying job, she says, she works as a residential supervisor at Cottonwood Group Home for the past 15 years. When she has free time, she likes to read, bake, and to explore the outdoors. I want to welcome Marin to our program. Marin,
Hello.
it's all yours.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting these presentations. They've been really interesting. The presentation I have is an extension of one of our permanent exhibits, Angels of Freedom. Martha Parker, who was one of the founders of the museum, researched and collected these local histories, which were then made into a book by the same name. Before we start, I'd like to take a moment to show you where you can usually find me, here at the Wakarusa Valley Heritage Museum. We're located inside Bloomington Park on the west side of Clinton Lake. Currently, we are open by appointment only, but just give us a call. Several volunteers live close enough to easily open up for visitors. We're looking forward to eventually being able to hold our community events again, like our Harvest Home Picnic or Ice Cream Social, the Kids History Camp, community reunions, and classroom tours are some of our usual events, and we hope to get them back up and running in 2021. The museum here pays tribute to the communities and the founding settlers in and around Wakarusa Valley. This map gives a point of reference to where the communities were and where the lake is today. The 10 main communities are Bloomington, which is where you'll find the museum, Clinton, Old and New Belvoir, Twin Mound, Richland, Lone Star, Siegel, Kanwaka, and Stull. While the valley's history is significant, the commitment to preserve it was not on people's minds in the 1970s, as farm after farm held their auction and land was bought out by the federal government. Families were displaced from generational farms to make way for Clinton Lake. Martha Parker and others found that history was literally being tossed out as folks packed up to move from their homes. Documents, deeds, artifacts, photographs were all saved from burn piles. So what do you do with all those papers and a plow and maybe even a wooden gutter, well, you start a historical society and eventually open up a museum. Our museum has two permanent exhibits, the one about the Underground Railroad, the Angels of Freedom. Our other one is the Wakarusa Valley communities, the early years, 1854 to 1874. There's various rotating exhibits, including history of the baseball in the Wakarusa Valley, or education in a one-room schoolhouse, or all about the agriculture. We're currently building our next exhibit, which will be a first in a series that will delve a little bit deeper into each one of our communities. We'll start with the largest of them, Richland. With Bloomington Park as our backdrop, we overlook the lake, or as some older residents say, the flooded valley. The old Kansas Avenue that ran from Clinton to Lawrence can still be seen crossing our property. And another more modern landmark is at the entrance to our drive. It's the sculpture Freedom Rings by Stephen Johnson. Our museum sits on the home site of Colonel J.C. Steele and was originally intended to be housed in his beautiful two-story brick home that was constructed with local materials. But unfortunately, it was vandalized beyond repair before any of that could happen. Lucky for us, there was a cow barn that could be remodeled instead. So some of the home is still visible. The rock steps are in our garden, and the upper story arched windows sit in our courtyard. The Steele family came from Ohio in 1857. J.C. Steele's life in Ohio had laid his path to the Free State activities he was in here in the Kansas Territory. In Ohio, he was one of the original organizers of the Free Soil Party and a member of the American Anti-Slavery Society. He declared the very day news came out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that he would go to Kansas to make it a free state. We haven't found any records of J.C. Steele participating in the Underground Railroad, yet with his abolitionist neighbors and close friends, we can assume that he would have been sympathetic to the cause. Now back to the presentation at hand. Tonight, I'll be introducing you to a few of the abolitionists and those who participated in the Underground Railroad in the Wakarusa Valley, and the men and women who moved here after escaping enslavement. And this is in no means a comprehensive list of all who participated. To start, I'd like to kind of set the scene to help explain why these settlers chose to come here. In 1854, Douglas County was opened along with the rest of the Kansas Territory for settlement with the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The immediate result of this act was a land rush from various factions that wanted a stake in the upcoming election, one that would decide the fate of the state. Would it become a free state or a pro-slavery state? Immigrants on both sides of the slavery issue came and established residency to try and cast their vote. To say that there was friction is kind of an understatement. There were outbursts of violence and intimidation from 1854 to around 1864. It was an era known as Bleeding Kansas. Douglas County was crisscrossed by the main highways of the day. As you can see on this 1857 map, the Santa Fe Trail cuts its way across the county in the south, and in the north, the Oregon Trail, or Old California Road, goes across in the north. The proximity to Missouri, which was a slave state, allowed for border ruffians to easily strike across the border and raid free state settlements. Lawrence was a target as it was a known abolitionist stronghold. The aim was to try by any means necessary to influence the outcome of the popular vote and thereby make Kansas a slave state. Settlers were met with harassment and intimidation. As Martha Parker states in her book, quote, "I will leave to others the question of whether settlers came for free land or to make Kansas a free state. But it is undeniable that after the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, many of those who settled in and around the Wakarusa Valley were avid anti-slavery men and fought along with those they were trying to free from bondage. Ultimately, men of both races gave their lives in their determination to free this country from slavery. And our next question is who? Who would choose to pick up their family, probably from a nice home back east, and move to a newly opened frontier territory, a labeled hotspot of activism, to aid and abet runaway slaves? Many who did come to offer support and a vote for a free state weren't fighters at all. Many were raised in the nonviolent Quaker faith in the abolitionist underground towns back east. Excuse me. These abolitionists were determined to keep Kansas from becoming a slave state. Immigrant aid companies were organized to help encourage and help the anti-slavery supporters move to Kansas. The Kansas State Historical Society writes that the most influential immigrant aid groups was the New England Immigrant Aid Company. The company negotiated reduced transportation rates for the parties of settlers they organized. They provided temporary housing once immigrants got to Kansas. They saw to building grist mills and establishing weekly newspapers. The first party from Massachusetts arrived in Kansas on August 1st, 1854, and stopped in the area that would become the city of Lawrence. By the next spring, 13 parties of approximately 1,250 people had come to Kansas with the support of the company. Other smaller immigrant aid companies were organized as well, like the Ohio Immigrant Aid Company that helped settle the Kanawha area. And so now let's introduce a few of the abolitionists who made their mark. Here's Joseph Gardner. In 1855, Joseph Gardner made a calculated choice to stake a claim in Kansas so he could support the Free State movement. By late 1856, his cabin was ready for his wife and 5 children to join him from Indiana. Active in the local anti-slavery activities, Joseph Gardner was one of the Immortal 10 chosen by Major James Abbott for a special operations team that led to a dramatic rescue of Dr. John Doy from a Missouri jail. Dr. Doy had been captured by pro-slavery men while transporting 13 fugitive slaves to Holton, Kansas. A very elaborate scheme was drawn up on how to instigate the jailbreak. This is Joseph in where the arrow is. The weekend rescue in July of 1859 was brilliantly executed. Joseph Gardner and another man's role was to escort a handcuffed supposed horse thief into the jail and then convince the jailer to accept him. Their acting skills worked, and the 2 men gained entrance to the jail, and the supposed horse thief was then able to free Dr. Doy and fled with the rest of the team. When the rescue party returned to Lawrence on Monday, July 25th, the streets were lined with cheering citizens, and this photo was taken in the street that day. Since Joseph Gardner's anti-slavery beliefs brought him to Kansas, it's no surprise that his cabin, located near Washington Creek, became a station for runaway slaves. His same convictions also gave rise to his openly hiring of former runaways and paying them wages. This act of kindness infuriated his pro-slavery neighbors, and a bounty of $500 was offered as a reward for his capture. It was in this cabin that Joseph Gardner and his family prepared for a raid that they had been forewarned about. A former runaway, Napoleon Simpson, and a second young African-American who were both employed by Joseph, joined in protecting the cabin as well. On June 9th, 1860, a little after midnight, there was a knock at the door, followed by, "Damn you, open the door." Much to the surprise of the intruders, Joseph, his son, and Napoleon were prepared for the gunfire. While the group successfully defended the cabin, a most unfortunate incident happened. Napoleon Simpson was mortally wounded. As he lay dying on the front stoop of the cabin, Joseph asked what he could do for him, and Napoleon replied, "Fight, fight hard." This testimony was recorded by the coroner and reported on June 14th, 1860 in Lawrence's newspaper, The Republican. Theodore Gardner, Joseph's son, later wrote his account of the tragedy. Next, we have Joseph's neighbor and cousin, Dr. Eliab G. Macy, and his wife, Rachel, who traveled from Ohio and were early settlers in the valley. They were known defenders for the cause of freedom and advocates for the oppressed. Dr. Macy freely contributed his financial means for their relief. The Macys settled in the Bloomington area in about 1855, and it was Macy's influence that had encouraged Joseph Gardner to come to Kansas and join in the Free State cause. Dr. Macy was to have been a candidate for the House of Representatives in 1855, but the Missouri border ruffians created chaos and stuffed the ballot boxes at the Bloomington precinct. With their illegal ballots, a pro-slavery representative was elected. Following Quantrill's raid of Lawrence in 1863, a small band of raiders traveled towards Bloomington in search of James Lane. While they didn't find Lane, they did torch and burn 2 cabins belonging to the Macys because of their well-known abolitionist stance. Macy's great-grandson later confirmed in a letter that Eliab had been active in the Underground Railroad. He noted that a neighbor living near the ruins of the cabins said he could see a fireplace with cooking utensils visible in the basement. They had been told that freedom seekers were often fed there. Moving over to the Kanawha area, we have the Colmans. Ezekiel Colman had been involved in the wallpaper manufacturing in Boston before immigrating to Kansas Territory with his wife, Mary Jane. Traveling with the Third Immigrant Aid Party, they arrived in Lawrence in 1854. They ran a grocery store in Lawrence before moving to their claim in Kanawha in 1858. Their home in Kanawha, known as Colman's Retreat, was located near the well-trodden Oregon Trail, California Road. Locally, it was also located in between the Free State stronghold of Lawrence and the site of the pro-slavery territorial capital in Lecompton. They had a secret door in the kitchen that hid a large space under the house that was used to hide slaves as they awaited passage to Topeka and on to the next station. On August 23, 1863, Ezekiel Colman woke to see the smoke rising in the east. He and his neighbors raced to Lawrence to offer aid and means of force to pursue Quantrill's raiders out of town. Our next abolitionist is Henry Hiatt. He was really a progressive thinker for his time and very outspoken with his views. He was raised in the Quaker faith, but was excommunicated early on due to his questioning nature. He and his first wife, Fanny, came to the Kansas Territory with their 5 children in 1856 from Ohio. Originally settling in Bloomington and running a steam sawmill, he then relocated 7 miles to the southwest, and established the town of Twin Mound. His home was known as the Hiatt House or the Twin Mound House, and was a regular stop to change horses on the Lawrence Emporia stagecoach line. Hiatt built a wind-powered grist mill along with a general store and post office for the town. But this isn't all that, there was more that happened in Twin Mound. The Hiatt House served as a station on the Underground Railroad. Hiatt wrote in his book, My Belief and Reason Therefore, that he had secreted slaves to a safe house in Topeka, which we now know is the Ritchie House, in his covered wagon that was built with a false bottom. John Brown is said to have visited Twin Mound in the Hiatt home. While Henry was friends with John Brown and believed in the same cause, he did not approve of the violent methods. Hiatt wrote in later years, having inherited a deep sympathy for those in bonds as being bound with them, I could do no other than give a portion of my life work and means to assist the slaves of the South in obtaining their freedom. There is a story that John Brown's wagon broke down in Twin Mound and was repaired at Hiatt's place. This photograph is showing what we believe to be John Brown's wagon wheel and axle. The stone building in the background is the one-room schoolhouse of Twin Mound. Hiatt was a strong advocate for education. He and 2 other neighbors bought land for that one-room schoolhouse. The Twin Mound School was still in use until 1966. It was one of the last one-room schoolhouses used in Douglas County. Hiatt also saw a need for higher education. He set his sights to build the Twin Mound Harmonic College. This college, based on his beliefs, would have been a really radical institution for its time, as it would have opened enrollment to not only white men, but women, as well as Black and Native students. Unfortunately, the dream to establish the college failed. We don't know whether it was that funding was hard to come by or due to the competition to establish a university in Lawrence, but for whatever reason, the college was never built. So like I said, this is in no way a comprehensive list of the abolitionists and free staters. These folks were only a portion of the men and the families that operated the Underground Railroad and participated in making Kansas a free state. A short list of those that I have not included are Judge John Wakefield, Oliver Barber, Samuel Walker, and more. As you can see on this 1857 map of Douglas County, the Wakarusa Valley had a large population of abolitionists and sympathizers to the Free State movement. The yellow represents the claims of these abolitionists. And so it's easy to understand why, with all the routes that crisscross through the valley and creating ease of access and the abundance of abolitionists in the valley, that it was pretty easy probably to operate the Underground Railroad here. In the aftermath of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, many African American families moved here, mostly settling in the Bloomington area. Now we can take a look at some of the free men, the runaways, the formerly enslaved, and their families that moved to the valley. These stories tell of their enslavement, the flight to freedom, and then the opportunity for private ownership and prosperity in Bloomington, Kansas. Here we meet George Washington and his family. Here's George. Born into slavery in 1840 in Virginia, young George was given as a wedding gift by his slave master, Daniel Jones Sr., to his daughter, Margaret Jones. Margaret and her husband went west to Platte County by wagon and steamboat with George in tow. Shortly after arrival, Margaret's husband died. She then married Lewis Miller in 1848. George worked on the Miller plantation until he found his chance for escape. And in 1862, he found his chance. He crossed the frozen Missouri River near Parkville, Missouri. I can't even imagine, in the dark of night, in the dead of winter, crossing what you really hope is a frozen river to get to a safe haven. It's a pretty scary moment. But he survived and he made his way to Condero on the Kansas side of the river and worked as a deckhand for a few months. He then moved on to Leavenworth, Kansas, where Senator James Lane was recruiting troops among free Blacks. George enlisted in the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers in August of 1862 and served until October of 1865. After his military service, George Washington moved to Bloomington. He settled on a claim just south of the Wakarusa River, just east of where the museum sits today. He married his neighbor, Arminda Simpson, in 1868, and they have a very large family with some of their descendants still in the Douglas County area. George Washington and his family were active in the Bloomington community. He was known and responsible for organizing the Emancipation Day celebrations each year. I want to take a moment and go back to George joining Company F of the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers. This African American regiment was organized before the Emancipation Proclamation and served in the Union Army during the Civil War. One of their first engagements for the 1st Kansas Colored Volunteers happened in October of 1862. Lieutenant Joseph Gardner, the same Joseph Gardner that we just talked about, headed Company F. George and his regiment advanced on a known pro-slavery guerrilla army in Bates County, Missouri, at what became known as the Battle of Island Mound. This was significant because it was the first time an African-American regiment alongside white soldiers fought on behalf of the Union. The bravery of these men helped change the minds of Northerners to support the enlistment of other African Americans. Napoleon Simpson never got the chance to settle in the Wakarusa Valley. He had come to ask for assistance from one of the local Underground Railroad stations. Joseph Gardner's in particular. We have discussed Napoleon Simpson earlier when I introduced Joseph Gardner, but I'd like to take a moment to share what we know of his story. After escaping Missouri to his own freedom in 1859, Mr. Simpson returned to rescue his wife from enslavement. Finding out that she was sick and unable to travel, and therefore unable to escape, Napoleon waited for better circumstances at the safe house, Gardner's home. Joseph Gardner offered him and another free man paid work to build a stone wall. This act of paying a black man a wage was considered rash in the 1850s and made Gardner a marked man. On June 9th, 1859, the Gardner home was attacked by pro-slavery supporters in the middle of the night. The gunfight ensued, and this is where we heard Napoleon Simpson say, "Fight, fight hard," as he died. The raiders then tried to set fire to their home, but were unsuccessful. Dr. Macy and Dr. Thompson, Gardner's neighbors, came to witness the death of Simpson later that morning. These men and Joseph's son, Theodore, submitted testimonies telling the details of the attack, which was widely reported in the newspapers of the time. Another freedom-seeking family in Bloomington was the Simpson family. We're not sure if they're related to the Napoleon Simpson. We haven't found a connection, but we do know about this family. They lived just to the east of George Washington along the Wakarusa River. Patrick Simpson, with his wife Melissa and their children, arrived in Bloomington around 1860 from Missouri. Patrick and his wife were former slaves, and assumingly all but one of their children were born during enslavement. Then Patrick lived to be the ripe old age of 104. The AME Church of Rock Creek was established just west of the Simpson home on land donated by Patrick and Melissa. Patrick's son Joseph enlisted in 1861 and served for 3 years. He then settled in Bloomington as well. Joseph's son, Joseph Jr., ran a grocery store out of his home and had the nickname of Butterbean due to his selling all his garden produce at the store. The Nickerson Cowan grave in the Clinton Cemetery, with its notations of his emancipation, is a testament to history. We don't know much about Nickerson Cowan, but what we do know is he was born into slavery in Virginia in 1799. He came to Kansas sometime between 1865 and 1870 as a free man via Mississippi, with his wife Sally and family at the age of 70. The family settled in Bloomington. His son Alexander married Harriet Kiser, sister of Doc Kiser. And here we meet Doc. Doc Kiser was born into slavery in 1853 in Alabama. His mother named him Dr. Perry Kiser, kind of wishful thinking, and everyone called him Doc. How or why Doc came to Kansas is a mystery yet to be solved. We do know that he married Ella Fishback on January 12, 1880. His daughter, Laurenia, an early member of the Clinton Lake Historical Society, retold the story of how he learned to read. Doc was tasked with taking the slave master's children to school in Alabama. Not allowed to attend himself, he listened to the lessons through the windows and practiced writing in the dirt in the schoolyard. Basically, where there's a will, there's a way. The diamond disc phonograph that we have at the museum was a gift from Laurenia and the Kiser family. This quote by Richard Cordley seems to sum up my presentation well. Early heroes were men of like frailties with ourselves, but the glory of heroism is not that angels come down to mingle in the affairs of men, but that common men and women, when the occasion demands, can rise to such heights of heroism and sacrifice. This is just a sampling of the stories from those who participated in the Underground Railroad in the Wakarusa Valley. Our museum is proud to be a repository of local history and these family stories. Here's just a few of the resources I have used, and thank you for your interest in the Underground Railroad and the history that shaped our area.
Marin, thank you so much. Such an extraordinary breadth and scope of the stories you tell. that are housed there at your museum. And if I could, if you could tell us where you are right now inside the museum, that's quite a wonderful backdrop that you have
Sure.
today.
Behind me is the Angels of Freedom exhibit that we have here, or part of it. And then I could show you on this side, we have our other permanent exhibit, all about the Wakarusa communities.
That's fantastic. And if individuals want to come and visit your museum, what is your current status and what's the best way to do that?
Well, we are open by appointment only, but it is just a simple phone call to get into the museum. I live close by, and we have several other volunteers who live very close, and we open whenever there's a need. We try to keep the groups small, just so we can easily clean in between groups. But anyone's welcome to call the museum and make an appointment. We're open, well, we used to be during normal times only on weekends, but with COVID times, we're open anytime.
That's wonderful that you and the other volunteers make yourself available in that way. Now, I want to remind those in our audience who are attending that if they would like to share a question, they can do it one of two ways. They can hit that question and answer button at the bottom of their screen and type in a question, or if they use the electronic cue at the bottom of the screen to raise their hand, I'd be happy to click on them, open their mic, and they can ask you a question out loud. In the meantime, I was touched by Richard's quote that you end with, because throughout this, I was thinking about the fact that these were ordinary people doing extraordinary things with great courage on everyone's behalf. And they were doing it without extraordinary resources to bring to task. As you tell these stories, how do you think their lessons play for our lives today?
Well, just courage is free, and it only takes a little bit of courage to listen to someone's story and see what they need. So
that's very nicely said. As you've done this work and you started bringing yourself to this work when you moved there 20 years ago, were you surprised by what you discovered along the way?
Oh, yes. I had no idea that this history was here. I barely knew that the lake was fairly brand new. It's still hard for me to really picture what the valley looked like before the lake. I'm fortunate enough to have talked with a lot of older residents, and I have board members who grew up here and have shared their stories of what it used to be like. So it's been really interesting to learn all of this.
One of the challenges of being a museum like yours is how do you engage additional generations? Now, obviously, when you moved in, though, as you pointed out in your introduction that you had sent me, you pointed out how some of the older members of the community engaged you. But now, 20 years later, how are you engaging young people to understand and appreciate these stories?
Well, during normal times, when we have more groups and classroom tours, we've gotten into doing a lot more for children, working with Watkins Museum. We've paired up with them to do the kids' history camps, and different kids groups have come through here, I think from Freedom's Frontier Camp as well. And then we've gone and done classroom talks, the water festival with all the 5th graders of Douglas County, and really kind of opened their eyes. They have a hard time seeing anything but a lake as well. And so it kind of blows their mind that there used to be farms and bridges and houses all underneath where the water is today.
One of the interesting things that we're challenged with, those of us who live here in Freedom's Frontier, is that there is such a strong perception that the Underground Railroad story happened back east.
Right.
At the very least, you know, Kentucky across the Ohio River or into Indiana or the like. There are really extraordinary stories that should be preserved on the Network to Freedom, right in the valley and the lake you live in now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And how important has it been for you to have the museum be on the Network to Freedom?
Oh, well, it's opened up our eyes. We've learned a lot from the other partners that are part of Freedom's Frontier. The office itself has helped, been a great resource in getting our information out to others, and giving people an idea of the connection that we all have to a bigger picture.
I appreciate that. If you wanted to leave our attendees tonight with one point along the way, what would it be?
That history is all around you. It's, you know, there's the history of your house, the history of your family, the history of your community, and you got to start somewhere. And some people that come to the museum have just started looking at the history of their family, and they use our family files that we have here to start the search. Other people are looking to see who lived in their house before them, what the history was. You can approach it from all different angles. The Underground Railroad is a huge topic. Although it happened here, you might find connections through your family, your home, your community. I certainly never knew until I started digging. So
It is a wonderful history that should be preserved and shared, and I thank you for doing such an extraordinary job doing that. Thank you for the presentation this evening.
Thank you.
We want to thank all of you for joining us this evening. We very much appreciate your participation, and we hope that you will continue to join us for additional stories about the other sites in Freedom's Frontier that are along the Network to Freedom. Thank you for joining us tonight, and have a good evening.